So in these verses, Krishna is talking about different planes of existence. So he says uh, the senses are higher than the external object or the lifeless object, things like stones. So the senses are higher than the uh, lifeless objects. Mind is higher than senses, and intellect is higher than mind, and the self is beyond the intellect, right? So he's explaining there are these different planes of existence, and then he gives the advice that in the beginning that you should be mastering your senses, and then you should stabilize your mind with the intellect, and then you should know yourself beyond the intellect, and that is what the liberation is, right? So beautiful verse. uh, let's unpack it. So the first thing is uh, there's an external environment of lifeless objects, right? Things like stones or different objects in the external world, right? And he's saying the senses are stronger than that external uh, objects, right? So that means like with the senses we can control this external object, right? With the senses we can hold a stone, or we can do different things to these external objects. In that way senses are stronger than the external objects. uh, then he says the mind is stronger than the senses, right? And with the level, okay, so let's go back to the senses again. So the plane of the sense, right, that is, he says, is the lowest existence on the level of our evolution, if you want to say that, right? So on the level of the sense, uh, the nature of the senses are basically, it has this attraction towards the sense object, right? It has this magnetism towards the sense objects, and it is natural. So in that plane, uh, if we are living on that plane, on the level of the senses only, uh, there is such a strong impulse to go to after the sense objects, right? And of course it doesn't have any kind of satisfaction in that. It's just that there is this magnetism between sense object and the senses, right? And on that level, this is all our action and reactions are happening basically, right? We just go after the sense object, and then the sense object, we get the sense object, another sense object, we get the sense object, and that's all that is happening on that level, right? Very lower level life, if you want to say that. Then he says on top of that, beyond that or higher than that is the mind, right? And the mind is the part of our uh, experience, or the level of, or the field of our experience, which is dominated by the base desires, right? So the mind is this impulsive element inside ourselves, which is uh, driven by things like acceptance, or things like reputation, or things like uh, reproduction or sex, or all these kind of very base level desires, right, that we have. In the modern terms we can call it amygdala, or lizard brain, but it is dominated by these very deep rooted base desires, right? So that is the layer of the uh, mind, where we are feeling these very strong desires for these very base level uh, fulfillment, but it doesn't have any substance, right? So we feel very uncomfortable, we feel very dissatisfied when we are in that plane of existence, but at the same time we feel very strong impulse to go after certain things, right? And those certain things will never satisfy us, but the impulse is there, that attraction is there. So that is the layer of the mind, that is the plane of the mind, and it is higher than the senses, in the sense that we can choose through the mind which sense we want to engage in, right? We can with the mind we can let go of certain senses like taste and smell, and we can engage more into in these kind of desires, which are more like praise, reputation, and sex, and all these kind of grosser desire, but which is still more subtler than the basic sense desires. So that is the plane of the mind. And then he says the higher than the mind is intellect. Now the intellect is the layer of the mind which is more like a reasoning, discriminative, or where we analyze the data that we have, or analyze our experience and decide whether this is right for me or that is right for me. Like maybe I know that sugar tastes good, but it's not good for my body, so I can leave the sugar. that kind of thing, or more righteous, or more this is not right, that is right, that kind of level, that is the level of intelligence, right? So in the level of intelligence, we our energies are more directed towards one direction, right? So we can be more methodical, we can be more systematic in our approach, we can put our energy in a particular desire, we can choose what is right, what is wrong, and engage with what and not engage with some things. So that kind of layer, right? So generally, if we are living on the level of intelligence, chances are we are going to be more successful, right? Because our energy are not so much dispersed in so many different directions. Chances are we can choose things which are more uh, wholesome or harmonious, right? So we are going to feel relatively more satisfied and happy as compared to if we live in the level of the mind and the senses. Uh, and we can build reasonably uh, good life, right? So that is the level of the intelligence. From if we are on that plane, and we are keep switching in these different planes. So Krishna is kind of explaining these are these different planes, and one is higher than the another, right? So intelligence is higher than the mind in the sense that with the intelligence, even though I have an impulse for sugar, but with the intelligence I can override that impulse, right? I can choose not to engage in that impulse. uh, in that way it is higher than the mind, you know. It generally looks like the mind is on top of the intelligence, right? So mind is using intelligence to, you know, figure out how to get the sugar and all different impulses that mind has, right? How can I get more acceptance and all these things. So intelligence is higher than the mind in that sense, right? The intelligence should be something that can, you know, control the mind if it is in the healthy situation. So that is the plane of intelligence. And then he says the self is the highest, self is the beyond the intelligence, right? And this self cannot be understood as a concept. We can of course understood as a concept, and we understand it as a concept like there is awareness, and the awareness is a unified field, or we can see it more like a quantum field. I mean, there is a ways to explain it, but it's not going to work because we are still in the same, we are talking on the same level, we are talking on the level of the mind and intelligence, and we are explaining something which is beyond the mind and intelligence. It doesn't mean it's some kind of an esoteric element, uh, but it's more subtler, right? So it can be, we can point out to that uh, self or the awareness or the consciousness, but we cannot, it's not very useful to uh, intellectualize it or understand it, right? It's only for the motivation, it's only for the inspiration, but it is more subtler, so it cannot be understood like this, it cannot be realized like this, right? And in terms of the self, it is said uh, that the self is the highest, and the self is where the you experience the way it is generally defined, or it is way generally it is explained, is self is a whole and complete in self, self is blissful, self is, you know, transcendental, and all these things, which may sound very, you know, out of reach kind of uh, explanation, but it's fairly simple actually. It's more like, you know, this flow of the mind and intelligence is so strong or so consistent that we just didn't have this, we just don't have this gap to see if there is something beyond this mind and intellect, right? And this is why some meditation practice is very useful in this kind of realization, that uh, so that we can just see, we can just, you know, slow down a little so that we can see if there's something beyond the mind and intellect, right? Nothing very esoteric, nothing very, you know, like out of the world experience or anything. It's just like there is a fundamental element behind mind and intellect, which is what is referred here as a self, and which he says is the highest than the mind and intellect, right? And then Krishna is saying, he's giving a direct advice here. This is one thing I love about the Bhagavad Gita. He explains everything and then he says, okay, this is what you need to do. So first thing he says, you have to master the senses. There's no way around this. Senses are, and why you have to master the senses? Because the senses has this pull, the senses has this, you know, attraction towards the sense object. So there is already a force in play, and you have to counteract that force, right? So if you want to have any chance of any reasonable life, you have to master your senses. Doesn't mean you don't engage in the senses, but you need to have the mastery over them. Very clear instructions, no place for ambiguity. Very direct. You have to master your senses. And then he says, then stabilize your mind with the intellect, right? You're going to feel these impulses and urges uh, to, acceptance or for reproduction or all these things. You're going to feel these urges and you're going to feel these impulses. But if you want to grow, or if you want to have any reasonably good life, you need to learn to, understand that this is not going to take you anywhere. This is like a drug or something, like, you just live on hit by hit basis. Yeah, you can get another hit, then you get another hit, you get another hit. Won't take you anywhere, right? You will stuck in a loop. So then Krishna is saying that we need to transcend this impulsive desires, impulsive based desires, right? And we can do this using the intelligence. We can do this using the proper understanding. And then he says, ultimately you need to transcend the intelligence and realize the self, right? And that is the liberation.